All right. Well, let's have a word of prayer before we get started. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants, you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. Lord our God, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Amen. That's from Psalm 8. So, welcome to our second study of the book of Psalms in our Lenten study. We've got a few people here who weren't with us during our first session. So I'm going to give just a very brief recap. So our first session, unfortunately, didn't record while we were meeting. So I'm going to put kind of a longer synopsis up on our YouTube page. But for those of us who are joining tonight, we are going through the book of Psalms. It's the longest book in the Bible, 150 chapters, 150 Psalms. It's very hard to date when this book was compiled. Some of the oldest Psalms, probably came with the people as the Israelite people as they entered into the Holy Land. And some of the later Psalms mention being in Babylon, by the rivers of Babylon in exile, and yet still singing the praises of the Lord. So that would be the 6th century BCE. And so we've got a collection of works that spans hundreds of years in Israel's history, and they serve a lot of different purposes. And you've probably noticed hearing the Psalms in church over the years that there are some that are happy, there are some that are sad, there are some that are very angry, there are some that are hopeful, there are some that are kind of wondering where God is. And so we're going to look at the different types of Psalms and what they mean. I invite your questions during all of our exploration. So if you have something, if you have a burning question about the Psalms that you would like answered, let me know and I'll try and work them in somewhere. So we noted last time that among the types of Psalms, scholars have noted that there are laments, prayers for help. That seems to be the most numerous kind of psalm. And some scholars have said that this type of psalm is the baseline. That's what all the other psalms are kind of based off of. We start with the lament, with the call for help, and then we explain how God has helped us, or we explain the way that God rescued us, or God's sovereignty that we know because we are saved by God's help. Laments are the grand majority of the Psalms. We've also got songs of thanksgiving. We've got hymns that are praises to the Lord and talk about the sovereignty of God. We've got royal psalms that have to do with the secular life of the people of Israel, the political life, the psalms about the king. And we have other types of psalms including some psalms that are more didactic in nature, that are meant for teaching. We talked about Psalm 119, the longest psalm, 172 verses that are basically organized as an acrostic using each letter of the Hebrew alphabet, 8 verses at a time. And with this psalm, it teaches the virtue of the law and the virtue of loving the law and relying on God based on God's promises through his covenant to his people. So these are the main ways that scholars have organized the Psalms. However, for our study during this Lent, we are going to use a bit of a different classification while we're looking at these Psalms. Noted Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann has said that really the best way to look at the Psalms without downgrading or casting aspersions on any other scholarship or classification of the Psalms, the best way to look at the Psalms is how they fit with human life. And so Brueggemann has postulated that one way to look at the Psalms is that the Psalms follow us throughout the course of life, from places where we feel very secure to places where our world has been turned upside down and we feel very insecure. And then places where we've been taken from that place of insecurity or anxiety or hurt or weakness into a new way of being by the power of God. And so following that pattern, Brueggemann has organized the Psalms into Psalms of orientation, Psalms of disorientation, and Psalms of new orientation. So I'll just read a little bit of Brueggemann to you here. It suggested that the Psalms this way, understood this way, follow the flow of human life, which is characteristically is located either in the actual experience of one of these settings or in the movement from one setting to another. So we're going to begin this week looking at the Psalms of orientation. Next week, we're going to be looking at the Psalms of disorientation. And the following week, the Psalms of reorientation, okay? Along with that, I want to try and gather in some of your questions and some other things that will help us to understand the Psalms and address those at this time. So this week, before we get into the Psalms of orientation, we're going to take just a little jog, a little side trek, and look at Hebrew poetry as a genre and what it means that the Psalms are poetic in nature. Then we're going to go into the Psalms of orientation. Next week when we meet, we will we'll talk about the Psalms of disorientation, and as part of that, we're going to answer Malin's question about or maybe maybe it was Malin's question, maybe it was somebody else who asked about what's up with the Psalms that invoke curses. That was Becky, wasn't it?
I think so. I think.
Yeah. So there are some places in the Psalter where we hear the psalmist, crying out for harm to be done on the psalmist's enemies, stuff like that. These are called imprecatory psalms, and we're going to look at that along with our Psalms of disorientation, because in our normal stable times we're not so prone to call down disaster on the heads of people that we don't like. It's when we're in a state, as my grandmother used to say. that we, that we like to show that dark side of ourselves. So next week we'll look at some of those imprecatory Psalms and what that means.
Cool.
So the week after next, when we look at the Psalms of Reorientation, we will also talk about Malin's question was, did Jesus talk about the Psalms, or did Jesus ever mention the Psalms, and how? And so we'll take a look at that also. And then our final week together, we will look at how the Psalms have been used in worship, not only in the Jewish community, but in Christian community as well. Like I've mentioned earlier, the Psalms play a role in every liturgy that we have in the Book of Common Prayer. And this is a very old tradition. The Psalms are the basis of prayer for many Hebrew prayers. And so we'll take a look at that in our last session together. And we'll talk about what does that mean for us as Christians now, and what does it mean to pray with the Psalms. So does that sound pretty okay going forward? All right. Does anybody have any questions that they want to throw out for things that we want to cover later? And you don't have to tell me right now. If if you think of something, shoot me an email or pop it up in the chat box, and we'll get to it. All right, great. So let's talk about Hebrew poetry. So the Psalms, like I said last week, the name of this book, Psalms, comes from the Greek, and it's a Greek name for hymns, a type, a style of hymnody. In Hebrew, the name of this book is the Tehillim, and that is hymns. And so what these titles tell us is that this body of work was meant to be sung. And you'll see a lot of what I like to call stage directions in front of many of the Psalms. And it'll say a psalm of, it'll say, for instance, a maskil, or a song of ascents, or some of them even will say to be played to the tune of such and such. Well, scholars don't always know what this means, but some of them it will say for the lyre. Well, we know what that means. That means that's the instrument that's meant to accompany this particular psalm. So we know that that these psalms were meant to be sung, and like songs that we have now, they're set to verse. Now, when we think of songs or verse or poetry, we think in our Western minds of things like rhythm or meter or rhyme. And the funny thing is that Hebrew poetry doesn't have any of that. And so it's a little bit hard to wrap our heads around. But one thing that, and scholars are still debating this, there are some scholars that have really tried to discern some kind of meter in the original language with within Hebrew poetry, looking at what syllables might be stressed and what syllables might be de-stressed. And there just isn't a consensus in the data. So, but the one overarching factor in Hebrew poetry is this phenomenon that's called parallelism. So how that relates to the Psalms is, you've probably all noticed when reading the Psalms out loud in church, that you'll read one line and the next line basically says the same thing, but with words rearranged, or maybe some terms are a little bit different. And this is what is parallelism in Hebrew poetry. So one line will state something, and the next line will state a parallel to that using just a little bit of a different phrase. And whoops, I'm throwing books on the floor over here. That's so for an example of this, if you've got your Bibles with you, let's look at Psalm 138. And we'll look at the second half of verse 7. So 138 verse 7b. I'm going to try and juggle two books here and see if I don't destroy myself in the process. All right, 138 verse 7b. You stretch out your hand and your right hand delivers me. A more exact translation of the Hebrew is, you extend your hand, your right hand saves me. And so here's an example of a really direct, a direct example of this parallelism. Another one, Psalm 89, verse 26. Oh, in the Hebrew, it's numbered differently. Hang on. Scratch that one. Well, the example that's given by Adele Berlin here in the Dynamics of Biblical Parallelism, this translated from the Hebrew, I will set upon the sea his hand, and upon the rivers his right hand. So again, you get this parallelism between sea in one verse, rivers in the next, hand in one verse, right hand in the next. So often in this parallelism, there's the first statement is more general, the second statement is more specific, or there are some modifiers in there. Parallelism takes different forms in Hebrew poetry. So here we've got an affirmative sort of parallelism where basically the two statements are very similar to one another. We've also got a negative parallelism where the second statement negates the first, or we've got kind of sometimes the parallelism is broken up into 3 lines rather than 2. That's a lot more rare. But this parallelism is the basis for Hebrew poetry. And we see it outside of the book of Psalms as well. You'll see it in the book of Job, when Job and his friends are discussing what's happening with Job. And later on, when God answers Job from the whirlwind, and when Job is discussing his own plight, each of these times, the speaker breaks into verse. And you'll see some parallelism there. You'll see a lot of parallelism in the Proverbs and in some of the wisdom literature, like Ecclesiastes. And also many of the Old Testament prophets will break into verse within their prophecies, and you'll see this parallelism too. So if you've ever wondered why the Psalms seem to be repeating themselves, and you seem to be saying the same thing over and over again, that is it. That is the defining feature of Hebrew poetry. Yeah. Any questions about parallelism and or Hebrew poetry? All right. I hope I didn't. Yes, Estella, go ahead.
Okay, so my question is, you say that it's the mark, that the parallelism is the mark of Hebrew poetry. What is its purpose? What is the purpose of saying it twice? To emphasize it, to make sure you got it right? Or is it because, like you said, sometimes they agree and sometimes they don't? Why would you say one thing and negate it in the next line?
Yeah, you were right in your assumption. It's emphasis. It's to really call the reader or the speaker or the singer's attention to what's being highlighted by the repetition. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, so we're on to Psalms of Orientation. So Brueggemann says that human life consists of, at times, seasons where we are satisfied and where we have a sense of well-being. And this can evoke gratitude for the constancy of blessing. And so it's under this sort of ideological umbrella that he puts the Psalms of Orientation. So in these Psalms of Orientation, hang on, I lost my place. What is evoked in these Psalms of Orientation is that they are statements that describe a happy, blessed state in which the speakers are grateful for and confident in the abiding, reliable gifts of life that are long-standing from time past and will endure for time to come. Life, as reflected in these Psalms, is not troubled or threatened, but is seen as well-ordered, the well-ordered world intended by God. They approximate a no surprise world and consequently a world of no fear. They describe how things are and indeed always are. These Psalms in various ways are expressions of creation faith, is what Brueggemann calls it. They affirm that the world is a well-ordered, reliable, and life-giving system because God has ordained it that way and continues to preside effectively over that process. At the same time, there's a profound trust in the daily working of that system and profound gratitude for God making it so. It's an affirmation that God's faithfulness and goodness are experienced as generosity, continuity, and regularity. So there's a number of reasons that these Psalms are part of the worship life of the people of Israel. And one of those reasons is theological. So that is to praise and thank God for the order that God has established. Brueggemann says that there's also a social function to these Psalms, and that is to sort of articulate and maintain a kind of sacred canopy under which the community of faith can live out its life with freedom from anxiety. These Psalms also reflect or could reflect the people who are more comfortable in that society. You know, we all know that we can, that many people among us in our society can recite the same Psalms and yet not feel that same sense of security. And so, you know, it might be, for instance, the authors of these Psalms might have been ones who can say that quote, lines have fallen for me in pleasant places, end quote, and that's from Psalm 16. So in other words, they've ended up with the best land and don't find it difficult to live a life of gratitude. These Psalms, when read by people who are struggling, can also have the effect of a sort of forward thinking. So they could point towards transformation and into a new creation, and a sort of eschatological manifestation of this goodness. So these Psalms, let's look at some more specific examples and take it out of the realm of the abstract here. If you'll turn to Psalm 8 with me. And do I have a volunteer to read Psalm 8? Anybody? Okay, I'll read Psalm 8. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants, you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? You have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. So in that psalm, can you hear that sort of establishment of the natural order of things and ascribing to God the honor for having created an orderly system? Let's look at another one of these. Psalm 104 is another really good example. Do I have a volunteer to read Psalm 104? We're not going to read all of 104 because it's long.
I'll do it, Brandon. Just tell me.
Is that Pam? Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
If you'll read 1 through 13, please.
Okay, I'm reading from the New American Bible, the Catholic Study Version. Bless the Lord, my soul. Lord, my God, you are great indeed. You are clothed with majesty and glory, robed in light as with a cloak. You spread out the heavens like a tent. You raised your palace upon the waters. You make the clouds your chariot. You travel on the wings of the wind. You make the winds your messengers, flaming fire your ministers. You fixed the earth on its foundation.
I think Pam might be stuck. Okay. Verse 5, you set the earth on its foundations so that it shall never be shaken. You cover it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, they flee. At the sound of your thunder, they take to flight. They rose up to the mountains, ran down to the valleys, to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. You make springs gush forth from the valleys. They flow between the hills, giving drink to every wild animal. The wild asses quench their thirst. By the streams, the birds of the air have their habitation. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. The psalm, like I said, is long, but it goes on in this way, and it lauds the very orderly system that God has put in place to feed and take care of the animals. That nature has its boundaries, and everything answers to God. So this is one of the songs of creation that sort of fall under this banner of Psalms of Orientation, according to Brueggemann. So the most foundational experience of orientation is the daily experience of life's regularities, which are experienced as reliable, equitable, and generous. The community that composes and sings these psalms readily affirmed that this experience is ordained and sustained by God. A proper response is one of gratitude. The world is God's way of bestowing blessing upon us. Our times are ordered by God according to the seasons of the year, according to the seasons of life, according to the needs of the day. In all these processes, we find ourselves to be safe and free. We know that out of no great religious insight, but because that this is the way life comes to us. Songs of creation. That makes, are we, yeah. Another sort of subcategory in this Psalms of Orientation are what Brueggemann calls the Songs of Torah. So for Israel as an organized community, just the same now as it was back then, the Torah is like the keystone. The first 5 books of the Old Testament is what they call the Torah, and that is the books that Moses gave to the people. And so we've got some Psalms that affirm the wonder and beauty of Torah in the life of the people. And this is another thing that anchors the people in this sense of God's goodness, God's providence, and in the regularity of life. And so as an example of that, let's look at Psalm 19. Do I have a volunteer to read Psalm 19?
I don't mind reading it, but I've got a different version than what I think most of you have.
That's totally fine, Vicki.
Is that okay?
We will be enriched by hearing different versions. So yeah.
Okay. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. In the heavens, he has pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilion, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes his circuit to the other. Nothing is hidden from its heat. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are sure and altogether righteous. They are more precious than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the comb. By them is your servant warned, in keeping them there is great reward. Who can discern his errors? Forgive my hidden faults. Keep your servant also from willful sins. May they not rule over me. Then will I be blameless, innocent of great transgression. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer.
Thanks, Vicki. Yeah, so we've got kind of a merging of two of these subgenres here, right? So in Psalm 19, verses 1 through 6, we've got that song of creation, where the psalmist lauds the orderliness of God's creation. In the heavens, he has sent a tent for the sun. It's rising from the end of the heaven, its circuit to the end of them, and nothing is hidden from its heat. And then the psalmist shifts into this song of Torah. The law of the Lord is perfect. The decrees of the Lord are sure. The precepts of the Lord are right. The commandment of the Lord is clear. The fear of the Lord is pure. The ordinances of the Lord are true, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know if you all noticed or not, but we've got some really lovely examples of that poetic parallelism in that section. This is an example of one of the Songs of Torah. And I think it's the fact that this sort of a song of creation and Song of Torah are kind of meshed together, smushed together in Psalm 19 here, sort of underscores Brueggemann's point that these are all psalms of orientation. It is to center the singer or the reader, the worshiper in this this well-ordered world that God has created, with the covenant law that God has given that is there to support God's people in their lives.
That's so reassuring. You know, I think about when I sing some of these hymns, and I've sung those words, but to hear that color on them, you know, to understand kind of the backing of them, and it's just reassuring. And it's almost like someone's telling you, hey, it's going to be okay. This is the way that the earth was created, and it was created for a reason. And it's just very reassuring.
So Brandon, how much of the Psalms in a service from that time period after these were written would this make up like of the service? So like, is this like the main piece of the service, or was it like our service today where we have music and we sing? Is it just something like that, or was this more of the service itself?
Yeah, so in the Israelite Worship, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So we touched on that just a little bit last week. Scholars aren't really sure. So if you look back in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, where the rules for what's supposed to be in the tabernacle and who's supposed to make it and all that other stuff are given, there are some mention of singers and musicians and dancers and poets, but there's not express rules for when these songs or poetry are to take place in the cultic practice of the Israelites. And so
it's not like we have a prayer book, right, where our services are kind of written down. Is there a Hebrew prayer book where those services are written down to where the Psalms are kind of inserted in?
not dating back to the earliest times.
Okay.
So, and now if, there are 5 main sects of Judaism today, and they all have their own prayer book. So, but it's hard to link contemporary Judaic practices to the earliest cultic practices of the Israelite people, because we just don't have enough data. Now, some of the Psalms are in their stage directions, like I like to call them, are called Psalms of Ascents. And scholars do believe that these were songs that might have been used liturgically as like a group of worshipers were approaching the Temple Mount or something like that, ascending toward the temple. But again, there's other scholars are not ready to hang their hats on that because there just isn't enough data. Yeah. Any other questions right now? All right. Probably the most famous of these songs of Torah and is Psalm 119. And we keep talking about it. I don't know if I'm going to talk about it every week. I don't plan to, but we're certainly not going to read all of Psalm 119 tonight because it is quite lengthy. I told last week's group, those of you who are new tonight, that when I was in elementary school, I went to a Christian school, and my 3rd grade teacher used Psalm 119 punitively. And so if kids were acting up in class, then she would make those kids stay in from recess and handwrite Psalm 119 until it was done. Which just sounds like torture, doesn't it? So if you will, please turn to Psalm 119. I'm going to look at it in our Book of Common Prayer because I've got it marked there. Let's look at Psalm verses 97 through 104. Anybody want to volunteer to read those 8 verses?
I will.
Okay.
Hold on, I gotta find it.
All right.
97 through
104.
Okay. Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day. Your commandments make me wiser than my enemies, for they are ever mine. I have more insight than all my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the aged, because I have observed your precepts. I have restrained my feet from every evil way, that I may keep your word. I have not turned aside from your ordinances, for you yourself have taught me. How sweet are your words to my taste, yes, sweeter than honey to my mouth. From your precepts, I get understanding. Therefore, I hate every false way.
Thank you. So do you hear in, so Psalm 119 goes through this pattern of these affirmations of the law and how the law instructs or saves the reader. And it's broken up by letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and in every 8-verse section, that section begins with that particular letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Each verse begins with that letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And maybe you heard some of the similarity in this section of Psalm 119 with the middle part of Psalm 19 that we read a few minutes ago. So you'll hear words like, I love your law, your commandment, your decrees, your ordinances, your judgments, and you hear how meditating on these things has benefited the reader. These things have made me wiser than my elders. They've given me understanding. They keep me from every evil way. And then we've got this, how sweet are your words to my taste. They are sweeter than honey to my mouth. And that's almost exactly what it was in Psalm 19 also. I don't know if you remember that. So here, Psalm 119 is this, didactic psalm that teaches love of the law. It teaches the benefit of God's commandments, and it teaches God's love for God's people through the gift of his law. And so this is there aren't many of this subgroup, the Songs of Torah, but they all sort of fit in the same pattern. When the creation is celebrated, it is acknowledged to be a well-ordered world. That order depends solely on God's power, faithfulness, and graciousness. That is why in the face of creation, Israel can only yield and praise. The good order of creation is concretely experienced in Israel as the Torah. The Torah is understood not simply as Israelite moral values, but as God's will and purpose ordained in the very structure of life. While the creation is sustained by God's faithfulness, it is also coherent and peaceable because of Israel's obedient attention to the way God has ordered life. Thus, creation and Torah are understood together, the Torah articulating God's intention for Israel in the creation. We're running a little short on time. I think I've been long-winded. I leave it up to you to let me know whenever I'm talking too much, and you can always do that, and I'm not ever going to get offended. You can even put it in the chat box saying, "Land the plane, Brandon." But I do want to talk about, Becky, go ahead.
So I'm assuming that like the psalm, that part of the psalm that we just read, if it was meant to be kind of instructive, it's almost like, would these be one of the psalms that you think was oral tradition? Or, I think you had said last week that there were some that we think that come from oral tradition rather than what David necessarily wrote.
Right.
It's almost like, it just reminds me of when I taught at the Catholic schools and they had to take catechesis class. It's like that teaching literature. And so I guess, was that kind of the point of some of these songs of Torah, as a teaching literature for the order of things? I don't know if I'm saying that right.
I think you're onto something there. I certainly think so, particularly with Psalm 119. Because it does take the form of an acrostic, and it goes through, a group of verses for every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. If you're teaching children their A's or their alepphs and bets, and you also want to instill the cultural knowledge of people and how great the law is and how much God loves us because he gave us the law. Like, that's the perfect tool. And I think you're onto something, because I think this is like a little Hebrew catechism in this Psalm 119. Yeah.
Well, I may be the heathen here, because if I were to meet this psalmist and I heard him going on and on about, I have done this and I have done that, and I'm perfect and I never stray from your ways, and I love your law and I'll never depart from it, I would think he was just insufferably arrogant. I mean, it's like saying, I've done everything you've commanded me to do. And how many of us can really say that?
Like, not one. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm better than my teachers.
Yeah.
Better.
I think if you're using this as a didactic tool, then you'd have to explain that these are aspirational statements. Yeah. Did I interrupt you, Becky? I'm sorry. Okay. Or their paradigms, their ideals, to aspire toward. Yeah. We'll get into that during a little bit more during our last session to see how the Psalms are used and how in worship and in the daily devotion. And we'll talk a little bit about different interpretations of these sorts of things. So stay tuned.
Okay.
To me, it seems like a good guide for a moral compass. I mean, that's kind of what I'm getting out of this. And it's surprising to me to see the different ways that it's written, because several people have read separate passages, but nothing. I mean, it's the same in mine that you're reading, but it's not the same words. And it's really interesting that there's just so many different, different ways to say the same thing. But yeah, interesting stuff.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, there's two more subgroups that I want to talk about just ever so briefly, because we're going on the top of the hour here. So there's another subgroup of the Psalms of orientation are called wisdom psalms, and they tend to also be didactic in tone. These are often kind of brief, and they teach wisdom much the same way that the book of Proverbs does. Let's look at, well, no, that's not very brief. Let's look at Psalm 14, and we'll just take a brief look at that. So right off the bat in Psalm 14 and verse 1, you've got this juxtaposition of the fools versus the one who does good. Fools say in their hearts, there is no God. They are corrupt and do abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. And Psalm 37 is another good example of a wisdom psalm. Do not fret because of the wicked. Do not be envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good, so you will live in the land and enjoy security. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. He will make your vindication shine like the light, and the justice of your cause like the noonday. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret over those who prosper in their way, or those who carry out evil devices. Refrain from anger, forsake wrath. Do not fret, it leads only to evil. The wicked shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. These you'll find a lot of parallels to these in the book of Proverbs also, but this is basically teaching the mindset of what it means to be wise. To be wise is to set your mind on God and trust in God for the fulfillment of things, and to leave alone things that will lead you astray, like anger, wrath, folly, things like this. So these are wisdom psalms. This is another psalm of orientation. And then finally, we've got a couple of psalms that seem to exist just for occasions of well-being. And these psalms of well-being are rich in gratitude for the way that this orderly system God has created works for us. That this orderliness and reliability is not just a theoretical or abstract notion, it's something that is felt by the psalmist. And as an example of that, I want to look at Psalm 133. It's real short. if anybody's gotten to it before I have, feel free to go ahead and read Psalm 133. All right, I've got it. How very good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity. It is like the precious oil on the head, running down upon the beard of Aaron, running down over the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord ordained his blessing, life forevermore. So this is, there's some really rich imagery in there. This is an expression of gratitude from someone who feels it, from someone who feels that this life of orderliness is beneficial, is given by God, and his only response is gratitude. So these are the Psalms of orientation. They talk about where we are in a secure universe. Next week we're gonna really slide in a completely different direction, and I think next week is really going to be rich for discussion. Does anybody have any questions or comments about Psalms of orientation, or have you felt yourself really connecting with these types of Psalms before? And if so, when?
I just feel like that especially when I'm disoriented and feeling weak and distressed and fretting, then those are, like you mentioned, it's a compass. And it's like it's just riding the ship a little bit. And even if I'm faking it till I make it, the saying of it tries to reorient you. So that's probably when I've appreciated them the most.
So this week's orientation, next week is what, Brandon?
Next week are Psalms of disorientation.
Orientation.
The following week will be Psalms of new orientation.
Are there Psalms next week that we can read in advance? So I feel like I want to say some things, but I haven't read all these up front, so I'm really not sure what to ask. I didn't know if there was something we can read for next week.
Sure. I'll send that out via email. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
So next week is when we get mad.
Next week we're gonna be awash in negative emotions. So just yourselves. So we're gonna cover the sad, the angry, the confused, the feeling of abandonment, the times when our enemies want to kill us, and we want God to heap burning coals on their heads and all that other stuff. So yeah.
We're going to see how firm our feet are set, as it has said today. And
Right. There you go.
So what's interesting to me is that, all this range of wisdom, emotion, it just plays into the human condition and what we've all as humans experienced over time, eons, that what we feel today and emotions we feel today happen since the beginning of human creation. And so it's really interesting to me. I appreciate the conversation and the dialogue that you're having with us, Brandon, on this.
Thanks,
I
Brian.
do like the way that this guy has, I like the order that you're putting this in, the orientation, the disorientation, this reorientation. I think I'm really going to appreciate that, because I always have felt like they were just all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like that.
Well, they kind of are all over the place, but in a beautiful sort of way.
Absolutely.
They really do span the entire range of human emotion. And because of that, Brueggemann says that's what makes them so accessible. We can enter the Psalms at any emotional point that we're experiencing. There's something in there to connect with.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight, everybody. I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate your participation. And like I said, if you got any questions, email them to me. I'll send everybody an email about what you can read for next time if you want to. You know, with all of the COVID stress and everything that's going on in the outside world, I really wanted to put together a Lenten study that didn't require very much on the front end for y'all in order to participate. But if you want to read ahead, I will totally send you some things that you can if you want to, and I will do that. And thank you again so much for being here and for doing this together.
Thank you for letting me join from Texas.
I'm,
I wish
Yeah,
I'm
it's
so
so
glad you
good
did.
to
It's so great to
see
see you.
good to see you. Yeah.
And I
all you
apologize for the
again.
technical difficulties and having to leave for a little bit.
Oh, yeah, we noticed that you were just still sudden.
Yeah, I didn't know if anybody heard anything I read, but everything just stopped on my computer.
It's all right. We got about half of it, and then we picked up and went forward.
Okay, all right.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.